Millionaire about to jump off a bridge is stopped by a homeless girl, but he grabs her arm and what he did left everyone in tears. The river below was a black mirror, reflecting a sky without stars, without a moon, without any trace of light. Michael White could barely feel the cold. His stiff fingers clutched the railing with useless force. His body swayed slightly, one foot already hanging over the void, as if the abyss was calling his name. The bridge was the same steps, the same cracked ledge, the scars from the accident still invisible to other eyes, but carved into every cell of Michael's memory. This was where it had all ended, and this was where he wanted to end it all again. Simone and Anna had died on that curve, on that rainy night. He had survived, and surviving had been the worst punishment. The voice echoed behind him, thin, unexpected, a breath of life breaking through the silence of his sentence. "If you're gonna jump, can I come too?" Michael turned around, more out of reflex than curiosity. And there she was, a small girl, no older than 5, barefoot, her feet covered in a thin layer of hardened dirt. She wore a grimy dress, which might have once been pink, her tangled hair and her eyes. It was the eyes that held him, huge, dark like the river, but with a glimmer that didn't belong to that night or that place. There was no fear in them, no pity, just raw, almost insolent curiosity, like she could see right through him. "What are you doing here?" Michael asked, his voice rough, rusted like the structure beneath his feet. "Waiting," she answered, as simply as if she were waiting for a bus. Michael blinked, confused. The wind tugged at his coat, but the girl didn't seem to feel the cold. She hugged her thin body, her bony shoulders visible beneath the worn fabric. She didn't belong there. No child belonged there, especially not at this hour. "Waiting for what?" The girl tilted her head, like the question was stupid. "Someone, you, whoever gets here first." Her answer unsettled Michael. He turned his eyes back to the river, trying to ignore her. The silence should have returned, but it didn't. Small feet shuffled across the concrete until she stood right beside him, so close he could smell her. A mix of dust, sweat, and that unmistakable scent of abandonment. "Why do you want to jump?" she asked. "That's none of your business," he snapped. "Why not?" she pressed, unfazed by his harshness. "If you're leaving, I can come too." Michael closed his eyes. He didn't need this. He didn't need some street kid ruining his final moment. But something in that voice, in that blunt honesty, kept his feet on the ground. "Don't you have anyone?" The girl shook her head. "My dad's sick, but he doesn't care much. Didn't even notice I left tonight." There was a hardness to her words, the premature acceptance of a cruel life. Kids weren't supposed to talk like that. But Michael knew some kids learn to survive on their own far too soon. "What about your mum?" he asked. "Never met her. I think she left before I was born." She said it so plainly, without drama or tears. Just a fact. Another loose piece in the incomplete puzzle of her life. She looked at him again like it was his turn to answer. "And you? Why are you gonna jump?" Michael pressed his lips together. "Because I don't have anyone either." The girl frowned like she was trying to decide if that was a good enough reason. "But you're rich," she said. "People say rich people are never alone." Michael let out a bitter laugh. "Money doesn't fill holes." She thought about that for a moment before answering. "If you jump, your hole's just gonna get bigger." It was a simple line, the logic of a child, and yet it stuck to Michael like a verdict. He turned to face her. "How old are you?" 5.5. 5.5. That was how old Anna had been when... He pushed the thought away before the pain could explode in his chest. The girl took 2 steps back, suddenly wary, like a skittish animal, realizing it had gotten too close. "I'm not jumping with you," Michael said finally. "Then don't jump," she replied. "Or take me with you." He didn't know what to say to that. And before he could find the words, she was already running back into the darkness of the bridge, her small feet tapping against the cold concrete. Michael took an instinctive step to follow her, but she was fast. Or maybe he was just too old and broken to keep up. Only silence stood between him and the river. Michael climbed down from the railing, his knees trembling, his chest burning with a mix of relief and shame. He still wanted to die, but not that night, not while those eyes still stared at him from the dark. In the distance, headlights sliced through the night. Michael walked toward them, not knowing what to call the feeling tightening in his chest. It wasn't guilt, it wasn't fear. Maybe it was just curiosity. Curiosity about who that barefoot girl with abyss-colored eyes really was. The cold hospital light pierced through Michael's tightly shut eyelids, forcing him awake from a heavy, fractured sleep. The sharp scent of antiseptic filled his nostrils, mingling with the distant memory of twisted metal and rain. He couldn't remember how he'd left the bridge. The last thing he recalled was the girl's face, small, thin, dirty, and those eyes. "Mr. White?" The nurse's voice broke through the silence of the room. "You're lucky. Someone saw you when you almost fell off the bridge. They called for help just in time." Michael didn't answer. His hands were covered in scratches, the skin rough, like he'd been trying to hold on to something that wasn't there. The girl, was she real, or just another hallucination from his exhausted mind? The medication, the guilt, the sleepless nights, everything had become a blur, but her eyes were too clear to be a product of his imagination. Once the nurse left, silence swallowed the room again. And in that silence, the flashes came. Anna, with her blonde braids, her cherry-red dress twirling in the rain as she ran across the park. Simone, laughing behind the wheel, her hair tied up in a messy bun, her left hand tapping the dashboard in time with some old song. And then, the impact. The shattering glass. Anna's scream that never ended. The silence. And the void. Michael pressed his fingers to his temples, trying to push the images away. But among them, another one surfaced. Bare feet on the concrete bridge, a dress that had once been pink, now the color of dust and abandonment. No matter how many times he tried to rationalize it, she had been there. She was real. 2 days later, Michael returned to his mansion. The massive iron gate creaked open slowly, groaning as if it too mourned his return. Inside, the emptiness felt heavier than ever. Every immaculate piece of furniture, every object perfectly in place, and yet the house was nothing more than a hollow shell. Michael wandered the hallways like a ghost, his footsteps echoing off cold walls. In the study he found Henry, his driver and trusted assistant. Henry had worked for Michael for over 10 years, back when the mansion was still filled with life and voices. Henry's discreet expression tried to hide his concern, but Michael didn't bother pretending to be fine. "I need your help," Michael said, his voice hoarse, the kind of hoarseness that comes from too much smoking, too much crying, or both. "I need you to help me find a girl." Henry frowned, surprised. "What girl, sir?" "The girl from the bridge." Henry knew enough about Michael's grief not to question him right away. He just grabbed a notebook and started writing. "Does she have a name? Any description?" "I don't know her name. She's about 5, thin, dirty, wearing a pink dress, or what used to be pink." Henry paused, raising his eyes. "A street kid?" Michael nodded, his gaze unfocused. "She stopped me from jumping. I need to find her." In the days that followed, Henry turned the search into a full-blown investigation. Armed with the vague description, he combed through neighborhoods near the bridge, spoke to vendors, homeless people, kids running through alleys. The answer was always the same. "There are lots of girls like that around here. invisible girls, lost in the city's grayness, forgotten before they ever had a story to tell. Meanwhile, Michael sank deeper into his own head. The house, the silence, the black and white photos hanging in the hallways. Everything seemed to mock him. The bathroom mirror reflected a man aged far beyond his years, his eyes sunken, his face lined not with time, but with the weight of the past. And every night, when sleep betrayed him, the girl returned. In his dreams, she was nothing but a silhouette in the mist, her bare feet leaving damp footprints on the floor. He tried to call out to her, but his voice wouldn't come, and then Anna would appear beside her, her cherry-red dress soaked in blood, and Michael would wake up gasping, cold sweat running down his back. On the third night, Henry brought the first real lead. There's a girl who sometimes shows up near an abandoned bakery about 4 blocks from the bridge. We can't be sure, but she fits the description. Michael was already pulling on his coat before Henry could finish the sentence. For the first time in months, urgency flickered in his movements. He needed to know. He needed to see her. The night was damp, the scent of rain hanging in the air. The bakery was dark, its windows shattered, graffiti covering the faded sign. Michael glanced around, his heart pounding faster than it should for a man who no longer expected anything from life. That's when he saw her. Curled up on the sidewalk, huddled against the wall, the girl held an empty soda can, absent-mindedly poking at the lid with her dirty fingers. The dress, now more grey than pink, was the same. And the eyes were unmistakable. Michael took a hesitant step. "Hey!" he called, his voice weaker than he intended. The girl lifted her head, her hair falling over her face. She recognized him, but she didn't smile. She didn't say anything. She just looked at him like she was waiting for him to explain why he was there. "You saved me that night," Michael said, unable to hide the raw emotion in his voice. The girl shrugged. "Are you still gonna jump?" The question was sincere, free of sarcasm or malice. It was just a practical curiosity. Michael knelt to her level. "Not today," he said. "Not if I can find you again tomorrow." The girl didn't answer. She just went back to fiddling with the can, while Michael, for the first time in a long time, felt that maybe, just maybe, it might be worth existing for one more day. The smell of rotting garbage and stagnant sewage mixed with the damp morning air. The grey light of dawn barely reached the bottom of that narrow alley where peeling walls formed a maze of forgotten places. Michael White had never been anywhere like this. His world had always been surrounded by tall walls, immaculate gardens, and central air conditioning. But here, where rats fought over scraps of food and flies buzzed above torn garbage bags, there was no luxury, no beauty, no order, only survival. He saw her before she saw him. Victoria was crouched beside a pile of rags and flattened cardboard, carefully arranged to form a makeshift bed. Her small fingers held a dirty cloth, which she used to wipe the forehead of a thin, almost skeletal man lying on the cardboard. The rough sound of a dry cough echoed through the alley, each burst shaking the man's bony chest, as if it might break him from the inside. Michael held his breath. It was her, the girl from the bridge, the bare feet, the filthy dress. But it was mostly the eyes that left no doubt. Even in the dim light, her eyes shone with that strange mix of curiosity and resignation, as if, at 5 years old, she had already accepted that the world was a hostile place, and nothing inside her could change that. He took 2 hesitant steps, his expensive shoes scraping against the damp ground. Victoria lifted her head and saw him. She didn't show fear, or even surprise. She just tilted her head slightly as if trying to figure out why he was there. "You again," she said, her voice low but steady. I was looking for you," Michael answered, unsure how that phrase might sound to a street kid. "I wanted to thank you." She shrugged, like the gratitude meant absolutely nothing. Her attention shifted back to the man lying on the ground. He coughed again, a wet, rattling sound that brought a trickle of dark blood to his lips. Michael took a step back, instinctively recoiling, but forced himself to stay. That girl had cared for him at his lowest. Now it was his turn. "Is he your father?" Michael asked, his voice hesitant. "Yeah," Victoria answered flatly. "He's sick." The man turned onto his side, groaning softly, his eyes barely open enough to register Michael's presence. Sunken, yellowed eyes locked onto him, and for a brief moment Michael saw his own reflection in them, the eyes of someone who had already given up, but whose body hadn't caught up yet. "Who's that?" the man asked, his voice rough and broken. "He was gonna jump off the bridge," Victoria answered, as if it were the most ordinary thing in the world. "But he changed his mind." The man coughed again, a dry laugh escaping between the spasms. "Rich piece of shit, can't even die right," he muttered. Michael felt those words hit like a slap, but he refused to react. The man was dying. What he said didn't matter. What mattered was Victoria. How was this little girl still alive in this place, in these conditions? And how could she look at the world without fear? "I can help," Michael said, trying to push past his own revulsion and discomfort. "I can take you both to a hospital, or bring food, clothes." "We don't want your charity," the man cut him off, spitting near his own feet. "Get out of here. No one here wants anything from you." "I do," Victoria said, finally looking at Michael with something close to genuine interest. Her father slowly turned his head, his eyes widening in disbelief. "What?" "I want to know why he came back," Victoria said without blinking. "Why he was looking for me." Michael knelt down to her level, the sour smell of mildew and sweat almost unbearable. But her eyes held him there. "Because you saved me," Michael said. "And because I can't stop thinking about you." "I didn't save anyone," she said, with the bluntness only a child can deliver. "I just said what I was thinking." "Even so," Michael insisted, "I want to help." "Help how?" her father interrupted, his voice dripping with sarcasm. "Gonna adopt her? Take her to your big house? Give her fancy food and toys? Turn her into some porcelain doll?" Victoria didn't take her eyes off Michael. She didn't seem ashamed of her poverty, or worried about what Michael thought of the place she lived in. It was as if she already knew nothing he saw that could define her. "You want to help?" Victoria asked. "Then help me get some water. We need to wash my dad's face." Michael nodded. That wasn't the kind of help he'd imagined offering, but it was the only kind she'd accept. He walked with her to an old, rusted faucet sticking out of a cracked wall. The water trickled out, thin and murky, but Victoria filled a plastic bottle with the practiced ease of someone who'd done it countless times. Beside her, Michael held his breath, trying not to gag on the stench of sewage drifting nearby. "He's really sick, isn't he?" Michael asked. Victoria just nodded. There was no fear on her face, just that cold, resigned acceptance, like she'd always known this was how things ended. But inside Michael, a fury was rising. How was it possible that a child so young had already seen so much? And how had he, with all his wealth, never noticed that there were thousands of invisible Victorias lining the streets he passed in his air-conditioned car? When they returned to the alley, Sergio's eyes were closed, his breath shallow and rattling, murmuring something between choking coughs. Victoria knelt beside him, wetting the cloth and gently wiping his face. The contrast between the brutality of that place and the tenderness of her touch was unbearable. Michael didn't know how or why, but there, in that filthy alley, he began to understand that the invisible girl had just become the most important thing in his life. The air inside the makeshift room was thick, damp, and heavy, as if the space itself knew the end was near. Anthony could barely breathe. Every inhale was a battle. Every cough tore invisible pieces of life from his chest, scattering them into the silence. From the doorway, Michael watched, his shoulders stiff, unable to decide whether to step inside or turn around and leave. Victoria sat beside her father, clutching his hand tightly. Her tiny fingers disappeared inside Anthony's rough, trembling palm, as though she were trying to anchor him to life through sheer will. There were no tears on her face, only a grave, concentrated expression, the face of someone who's seen death up close and knows crying won't change a thing. "She's always been strong," Anthony's voice rasped, cracked and faint. "Stronger than me." Michael took a hesitant step inside. The sight of the man, thin as a walking corpse, skin yellowed and stretched tight over brittle bones, was uncomfortable even for someone like Michael, who knew his own share of pain. Anthony wasn't a good man. Michael knew that without having to ask. But he was a broken man, and somewhere between his mistakes and failures, he'd carved out one untouched corner of himself for that barefoot girl with storm-colored eyes. "I can help," Michael repeated, for the third or maybe fourth time since finding them. "I can take you to a hospital." Anthony laughed, or tried to. The sound came out as a painful wheeze. "I'm not leaving here, Doc," he said, spitting blood between his words. "This body's too broken, not worth the trouble." Michael didn't know what to say. He felt out of place, like he was intruding on something too intimate, but at the same time, there was something holding him there. An invisible responsibility he couldn't explain, only that it wouldn't let him walk away. "You've got money," Anthony went on, his dull eyes locked on Michael, "but money doesn't buy everything, doesn't buy shame, doesn't buy forgiveness." Michael didn't argue. He knew that all too well. Anthony drew in a shaky breath, his chest rattling with the effort. Victoria stayed by his side, unmoving, her eyes fixed on her father's face. Michael wondered how many times that little girl had seen him on the edge of death, and how many times she'd already learned to brace herself for losing everything. "I screwed up a lot," Anthony whispered. "One mess after another. Drank too much. Hit too much. Left her behind more than once. But she—" His voice faltered, and for a moment Michael thought he was gone. But Anthony coughed again, a wet, choking sound, before finishing. "She's the only thing I ever got right." Victoria's hand squeezed his tighter. She didn't cry, didn't speak, just listened. As if this moment was more for him than for her, a final chance to grab onto some scrap of redemption before the end. "I'm not her blood father," Anthony said, his voice lower, almost a whisper. "But I'm her father in life. I'm the one who stayed, taught her to walk, to talk, even when I had nothing to give. She's all I've got." Michael felt a knot tighten in his throat. The guilt flared, because he knew exactly what it was like to cling to a child as your last anchor. And he knew what it was like to lose that anchor and drift into nothing. Anthony turned his head with effort, his sunken eyes locking onto Michael's once more. "I know who you are," he said. "I know you're rich as hell, live in a house so big you've got rooms just for shoes, but that doesn't mean you don't know what it feels like to lose." Michael held his breath. He hadn't expected that. "I don't care if you're crazy or guilty or haunted by whatever ghosts you carry," Anthony went on. "Just promise me one thing." Michael took another step forward, hesitant. "Take care of her. If I die, take care of her." The words fell into the room like lead. Michael couldn't answer right away. He could barely take care of himself. He was the last person in the world who should be responsible for a child. But then he looked at Victoria, so small, so silent, and saw something in her. Something in her eyes that said maybe she'd already saved him, without either of them realizing it. "I promise," Michael said, the words coming from somewhere deep inside him, a place he hadn't touched in years. Victoria looked up at him, and this time there was something different in her eyes. A flicker of hope, maybe, or distrust. Maybe both, but she didn't say anything. She just held her father's hand a little tighter. Anthony tried to smile. "That's good," he murmured. "That's good." The final breath was short, fragile, cut off halfway through. His hand loosened in Victoria's grip, and then silence. The girl leaned over her father's chest, as if listening for something she knew wouldn't come. And still, she didn't cry. She just stayed there, holding on to him like her warmth might keep him close for a little while longer. Michael felt the weight of the scene press into him, sinking into his skin. There was no turning back, no escape. Without asking, without planning, this girl had just become his responsibility. He knelt, slipped one arm under her small, fragile body, and lifted her into his arms. Victoria didn't resist. She just rested her head on his shoulder, accepting the embrace, not out of trust, but out of sheer exhaustion. Michael walked out of the alley, carrying a promise he had no idea how to keep, but knew he couldn't break. The echo of Michael and Victoria's footsteps felt almost out of place in the cold, bureaucratic lobby of the grey building. The peeling walls and worn-out furniture of the DIF office stood in stark contrast to the quiet elegance of Michael's tailored suit and the loose, freshly washed dress Victoria wore. One of the few pieces of clothing Henry had managed to find on their way there. Michael held Victoria's small hand, but she didn't hold his back. She walked beside him, eyes downcast, her feet shuffling against the floor as if ready to run at any moment. The tension between them was palpable. Ever since they'd left that alley, a heavy silence had settled between them, a silence full of questions neither of them knew how to ask. The social worker behind the narrow desk barely looked at Michael before flipping through the paperwork. Her chipped nails tapped rhythmically against the folder, a sound that seemed to magnify Michael's rising anxiety. "Are you related to the child?" she asked, without lifting her eyes. "No," Michael answered, adjusting himself in the uncomfortable chair. "But her father asked me, before he died, he asked me to take care of her." The social worker paused her writing and finally looked at him. Her gaze was clinical, professional, but carried that subtle judgment Michael knew so well. The same look doctors and psychiatrists gave him whenever they reviewed his medical history. "Do you have any experience with children?" she asked. Michael hesitated. "I had a daughter," he answered, his voice barely above a whisper. "She passed away." For a brief moment, the woman's expression softened, but it quickly returned to its usual bureaucratic detachment. "Mr. White," she began, "the DIF does not typically grant temporary custody to individuals with no familial connection to the child, especially not in cases like yours." She hesitated, "with a psychiatric history and a recent suicide attempt." Michael took a deep breath. He knew this was coming. The word was stamped across his file like a brand. Unstable. Potentially dangerous. Emotionally compromised. "I know I'm not the ideal candidate," he admitted, his voice trembling with raw honesty, "but I promised her father. She has no one. I can give her what she's never had." The social worker sighed. "The girl was evaluated by our field team. She shows clear signs of chronic neglect, malnutrition, and likely severe emotional trauma." She closed the folder. Placing her with someone who's still navigating their own trauma doesn't seem like the best solution. Victoria, sitting beside Michael, swung her feet beneath the chair, not looking at anyone. She didn't cry, didn't ask for anything. She was just there, a silent presence that somehow seemed invisible to the very system meant to protect her. "I can prove I'm capable," Michael insisted. "Do home visits, talk to my doctor, evaluate me however you need to. Just, please, don't send her to a shelter." The word shelter made Victoria lift her eyes for the first time. There was something in that word that lit up a warning inside her, a memory too heavy to say out loud. But she stayed silent. "We'll begin a profile review," the social worker said, her tone making it clear the conversation was ending. For now, she'll be placed in temporary care. Depending on the results, we may reconsider a provisional custody arrangement. But you need to understand. She met Michael's eyes directly. The DIF's priority is the child's well-being. And right now, you're still an unknown. Michael walked out of the building feeling smaller than when he walked in. Victoria walked beside him, no longer holding his hand. The silence between them was no longer awkward. It was familiar. As if they both understood that silence was the only common ground they had. Back at the mansion, Michael had no idea what to do with her. Victoria occupied the house the same way she'd occupied the streets, silently, staying close to the edges of the walls, moving carefully, not touching anything, not asking for anything. The vast house, once suffocating with its emptiness, felt even bigger with her small presence filling the corners. The first night, Michael put her in one of the guest rooms, a canopy bed so big it seemed to swallow her whole. Victoria sat on the mattress, hands folded in her lap, eyes fixed on the door, like she already knew she didn't belong there, and maybe she didn't. Michael stood in the doorway, chest heavy with guilt and inadequacy. Every time he looked at Victoria, it was impossible not to see Anna, and it was impossible not to remember all the ways he'd failed his own daughter. On the second night, Victoria slept on the floor beside the bed, curled up under the thin blanket she'd brought from the alley. She didn't trust the comfort of the mattress. She preferred the familiar hardness. On the third day, Michael tried to cook for her, simple pasta, jarred sauce. Victoria ate in silence, chewing slowly, with the wariness of someone who knew food could disappear at any moment. Michael wanted to ask about Anthony, about her mother, about anything. But the words died before they reached his mouth. On the fourth night, Michael woke up screaming. A nightmare. Anna, the car, the bridge, the sound of glass shattering. When he opened his eyes, Victoria stood at the doorway, watching silently. I'm fine, he said, voice cracked and unsure. Victoria just turned around and disappeared down the hall. It was then that Michael realized she knew him better than he thought. She knew what it was like to wake up screaming. She knew what it was like to live with ghosts. The only difference was she'd never had anyone to protect her from them. And maybe, just maybe, Michael could be that person. Even if he was broken, but the system, the forms, the rules, they didn't believe in broken men saving invisible girls. The waiting room of the clinic was too clean, too white, smelling of disinfectant with muffled footsteps and distant phones ringing somewhere down the hall. Victoria sat at the edge of her chair, swinging her legs, her face an unreadable mask. The girl didn't cry, didn't complain, didn't show any fear. She just waited, as if her whole life had been one long hallway of waiting. Michael sat beside her, pretending to read a magazine. But his mind was anywhere else. Medical appointments were a minefield. Every test, every question, every glance from the medical staff echoed that day. The day he and Simone took Anna to her last appointment. The appointment that never ended because hours later they were both dead on the bridge. He pushed the memory away before the taste of metal returned to his mouth. "Victoria!" the nurse called from the door. The girl stood up without looking at Michael and walked into the exam room alone. Michael wanted to follow, but sensed that this was hers, a moment that didn't belong to him yet. It was too soon to intrude. So he stayed in the waiting room, counting the minutes. 23 minutes later, the same nurse came back and called him in. Inside the room, the doctor was reviewing a worn folder, her fingers sliding over the papers with a subtle expression of perplexity. "Are you her legal guardian?" the doctor asked, eyes still on the documents. "Temporarily," Michael replied. "Why?" The doctor adjusted her glasses, her tone too careful to be routine. "We're having some trouble accessing Victoria's full medical history," she explained. "Her records in the DIF system are incomplete, no maternal information, and there are inconsistencies in the father's data." "What do you mean?" Michael's brow furrowed. The doctor turned the monitor toward him. "There's no record of a mother. And as for the father, well, the blood type listed for Anthony isn't compatible with Victoria's." A chill ran down Michael's spine. "They're not compatible?" The doctor shook her head. "Biologically, Anthony can't be her father." The words hung in the air, heavy with implication. Victoria, still sitting on the exam table, swung her legs like none of this had anything to do with her. But Michael knew. Everything about this girl was a secret waiting to unravel. "It could be a clerical error." The doctor tried to soften the blow. "That's not uncommon with children from the streets, but if you want to look into it." Michael didn't answer. He just took the printout she handed him and led Victoria out of the clinic. The car ride back was silent. Victoria played absent-mindedly with a rubber bracelet on her wrist, completely unaware of the storm building inside Michael. Back at the mansion, Michael grabbed his phone and called without hesitation. "Henry, find someone for me. A private investigator, someone discreet," Michael said, staring at the crumpled paper in his hand. "I want to know who Victoria's mother is, and I want to know who her real father is." Henry didn't ask questions. He just did as he was told. The investigator was a dry, no-nonsense man with wary eyes and a battered leather briefcase. They met in Michael's study, surrounded by shelves of books no one read anymore, and the faint scent of old wood. "She's a street kid," the investigator said after the first week of digging. "Kids like her pop up and disappear all the time. But this one..." He opened the folder. Old documents, faded photos, newspaper clippings. "Anthony wasn't her father," he confirmed. "But he raised her since she was a baby. She showed up at his shack when she was just a few months old. No official birth certificate, just a piece of paper with the name Victoria scrawled on it." Michael flipped through the pages, his heart beating faster with every word. The mother's name, Vanessa. No last name. Just a fragment of identity buried in the medical records of a now-defunct underground clinic. "Vanessa?" Michael repeated. "Who is she?" The investigator slid over a grainy photo, a security camera, still from an abandoned factory. In the image, a young woman held a baby wrapped in a blue blanket. Behind her stood a man, tall, wearing an expensive suit, his face turned just enough for the camera to catch his profile. Even in low resolution, Michael recognized him immediately. "David Bennett," the investigator confirmed. "Businessman, owns half the industrial zone in this city." The name hit like a weight to the chest. Michael knew the name, not personally, but from economic reports, corruption scandals that quietly disappeared, and stories whispered in business circles. David Bennett was untouchable, a man who built an empire on bones and silence. "What does he have to do with Victoria?" Michael asked, though the answer already tasted bitter in his mouth. "He's her biological father," the investigator said. "Vanessa worked at one of his factories. They had an affair. When she got pregnant, David did everything to erase the evidence, paid for her to disappear. But Anthony, who worked as a mechanic for him, found out and helped Vanessa escape. Not long after, Anthony lost his job in a so-called accident, orchestrated by David." Michael closed his eyes for a moment. Each new piece clicked into place, forming a grim, familiar picture. One where Victoria was nothing more than collateral damage in the greed of men like David. "Does David know she's alive?" Michael asked. "No," the investigator said, "but if he finds out, he'll want her gone. Men like him don't leave loose ends." Michael turned toward the window, where Victoria stood alone in the garden, kicking a worn-out soccer ball with a solemn focus. She had no idea that her very existence was a threat. And now Michael knew that the promise he'd made to Anthony was even bigger than he'd thought. Protecting Victoria wasn't just about kindness or some moral obligation. It was about survival. The truth cut into Michael like a blade. He was stepping into a war he might not win. But as he stood there watching Victoria, so small, so quiet, so full of invisible scars, he made another promise. One he didn't need to say out loud. As long as he was breathing, no one would hurt that girl. No one. The rain drummed softly against the mansion's windows when Henry stepped into Michael's study. His serious expression and the worn folder tucked under his arm made it clear this wasn't going to be a routine conversation. "She showed up," Henry said without preamble. Michael, seated in the leather armchair, set down the glass of whiskey he'd been slowly turning in his fingers. "Who?" he asked, though he already knew the answer. "Vanessa," Henry confirmed, Victoria's biological mother. Michael didn't say anything. Deep down, he'd always known this moment would come. After discovering that Victoria was David Bennett's daughter, it was only a matter of time before ghosts from the past started crawling back toward her. He just hadn't expected the first ghost to be the woman who brought her into the world. "Where is she?" Michael asked. "At the gate," Henry said. "She wants to come in." Michael's heartbeat quickened. Part of him wanted to turn her away, to make her disappear before Victoria even knew she existed. But the other part, the part that knew the weight of being a failing father, of losing a daughter, of carrying that guilt like a stone in his chest, that part knew it wasn't that simple. "Bring her to the sitting room," Michael said. "I want to hear what she has to say." Vanessa was almost unrecognizable compared to the young woman in the grainy photos Michael had seen in the investigator's file. Time and constant fear had worn her down. Her dark hair, twisted into a messy bun, was streaked with grey at the temples. Deep circles framed her eyes. Her skin was lined and thin, the kind of wear only years of running could carve into someone's face. And yet, in her eyes, there was a stubborn flicker, the same spark Michael had already seen in Victoria. She stepped inside cautiously, gripping the strap of her purse so tightly her knuckles turned white. "Thank you for seeing me," she said, her voice low, almost disappearing into the rain beyond the windows. Michael gestured to the armchair across from him. Vanessa sat down, shoulders stiff, body coiled like she was ready to bolt at any second. "Why now?" Michael asked, straight to the point. Vanessa dropped her gaze, took a shaky breath before answering. "Because I heard Anthony died, and because I know who you are. I know Victoria's here, with you." "And what do you want?" Michael asked, keeping his tone neutral. "I want to see my daughter," Vanessa said, her voice cracking slightly on the last word. I want to tell her the truth. I want her to know I never wanted to leave her." Michael crossed his arms, fighting the surge of distrust and anger rising in his chest. "You disappeared for 5 years," he said. "You left your daughter on the streets with a dying man, and now you want to walk back in like none of that happened?" Vanessa's hands clenched together in her lap, her fingers trembling. "You don't know what David did to me," she said, her voice splintered at the edges. "He found me when I was pregnant, told me he'd kill me, told me if I didn't vanish, he'd make sure Victoria ended up in some orphanage far away with a name no one would remember. I didn't have a choice." Michael stayed silent. He believed her, not because she'd earned his trust, but because he knew exactly what David Bennett was capable of. The cruelty of men like David didn't need to be exaggerated. Michael had lived long enough in the same world to know it was all true. "And why didn't you come back sooner?" Michael pressed. "Why now, after all this time?" Vanessa inhaled sharply, her eyes glassy with unshed tears. "I tried," she said. "Every time I tried, someone followed me. I'd get letters, threats. David never forgot. I was a coward. I chose survival over fighting for her." The confession hung in the air, bitter and heavy. Michael recognized the taste. Guilt, the kind that ate you alive from the inside, the kind he carried himself. "Victoria doesn't know you exist," Michael said. "And to be honest, I'm not sure she should." Vanessa's eyes widened, desperate. "She has to know," Vanessa pleaded. "She might hate me. I deserve that. But she needs to know that I loved her, even from a distance." Michael rubbed his temples, his head pounding. There was no simple answer. Vanessa was her mother by blood, but Michael was the one who'd stayed, the one who'd carried her out of that alley, who'd made a promise to a dying man. And he knew, with the same certainty he knew his own daughter was never coming back, that Victoria already saw him as her only safe place in the world. "She's asleep right now," Michael said. "I'm not waking her, but I'll think about it. And if she wants to see you, I won't stop her." Vanessa nodded, her eyes brimming with tears she stubbornly refused to shed. "Thank you," she whispered. Michael walked her to the door. She paused at the threshold, the rain still falling in thin sheets across the driveway. "Michael," she called softly before leaving, "take care of her, even if she hates me. Please, don't let her grow up thinking she doesn't deserve to be loved." Michael stood there, watching her fade into the rain. When he turned back inside, he found Victoria standing at the top of the stairs, her arms wrapped around the banister, eyes half closed with sleep. "Who was that?" she asked, her voice husky from exhaustion. Michael hesitated for just a second. "Someone from the past," he said, "but the past doesn't have to come inside, not unless you want it to." Victoria didn't ask anything else. She simply walked down the stairs and stood beside Michael, her small hand tugging at the hem of his shirt like it was her lifeline. And in that simple touch, Michael knew. Vanessa may have given Victoria life, but he was the one learning how to be her father. And no matter how loudly blood might call, it was the love they built, day by day, choice by choice, that would shape Victoria's future. But the past never really disappears. And Michael knew Vanessa was only the first piece in a game that was far from over. The courtroom was smaller than Michael had imagined. It lacked the grandeur of movie courtrooms, the imposing air of rooms where fortunes were decided. But here, between beige walls and worn wooden benches, the greatest battle of his life was about to begin, one that didn't involve contracts or assets, but something infinitely more valuable: Victoria. She sat in the front row, her feet nervously swinging back and forth. The light blue dress Henry had picked out for her looked too big on her thin frame. Michael could feel her tension even without looking directly at her. He knew that this place, full of adults talking about her as if she were a thing to be fought over, triggered every fear of abandonment and rejection she carried. At the far end of the room, David Bennett sat quietly. The man who, until recently, was a near mythical figure in the world of business now looked like a shadow of himself. His skin was grayish, his shoulders slumped, and a dry cough rattled from his yellowed teeth. Illness was devouring his body like termites, hollowing out a wooden throne, but his eyes still held that cold, calculated gleam of a man who had never learned how to lose. The hearing opened with formalities. David's lawyer stood, weaving a speech polished by years of court theatrics, arguing that as Victoria's biological father, David had the legal right to claim custody. Blood, they said, was the ultimate currency. As though blood alone made someone a parent. They ignored the fact that David hadn't spent a single day of his life thinking about the girl until she became the final piece in his desperate attempt at public redemption. "My client," the lawyer said, his voice perfectly modulated, "is a man who deeply regrets his past mistakes and wishes to spend his remaining days correcting them. Victoria is his flesh and blood, his rightful heir. The best way to ensure her future is to return her to her biological father, who, despite his declining health, has both the resources and the love to care for her. Michael's stomach twisted at the word love. Hearing it from David's mouth was an insult. When it was Michael's turn, he didn't rise immediately. Instead, he glanced at Victoria, whose wide, anxious eyes followed him. The same mix of fear and hope she'd carried ever since he pulled her out of that alley. He took a slow breath and stepped forward. "Your Honor," he began, his voice steady but without bravado. "I'm not Victoria's biological father. We don't share a single drop of blood, but that doesn't mean I'm not her father." The judge's eyes studied him closely, measuring every word. "I met Victoria on a bridge," Michael continued. "The day I decided I had no reason left to live. I thought my life ended the day I lost my wife and daughter. But that night on that bridge, a 5-year-old girl saved my life." His words echoed in the quiet room, filling a space usually reserved for cold legal arguments. This wasn't a legal defense. It was a confession. "Since that night, I've been learning how to be a father again," Michael said. "Not because life gave me the chance, but because Victoria did. She taught me that family isn't about blood. Family is about who stays, who holds your hand in the dark and reminds you there's a tomorrow." Across the room, David let out a harsh, bitter laugh. "A failed, unstable suicide case wants to raise a child. What a beautiful world we live in," he rasped, his voice as poisonous as ever. Michael turned to face him. "Yes, an unstable man," Michael replied calmly, "but a man who chose to fight. And unlike you, David, I didn't abandon her the moment things got difficult." Michael's lawyer handed the judge a thick folder, a meticulously documented record of Victoria's time with Michael. Medical reports, psychological evaluations, progress notes from the DF, every day accounted for. Each document painted a clear picture. Victoria was recovering, slowly, cautiously, but undeniably. But it was when Vanessa walked into the room that everything shifted. She walked in with hesitant steps, but held her head high. Each step was a battle against her own past. She took her seat at the witness stand and told her story. The affair with David, the threats, the staged accident that nearly killed Anthony, the desperate flight to save Victoria. Her voice trembled, but she didn't stop. She looked David directly in the eyes and described in excruciating detail the threats he made. She spoke of the men he sent after her, the notes left under her door. And finally, she described the phone call, the one where David said it would be easier to kill the baby than to acknowledge her existence. The silence in the courtroom was suffocating. The final blow came when Michael's lawyer called a former engineer from David's factory to the stand. The man confirmed that the accident that crippled Anthony wasn't an accident at all. It was deliberate sabotage ordered directly by David to silence a man who knew too much. Michael didn't know what was stronger, his fury or his nausea. But the last word didn't come from him or Vanessa or any lawyer. It came from Victoria. At just 5.5, she stood up, walked into the center of the room, and asked to speak. Her voice was small, but it didn't waver. "I want to stay with Michael," she said, looking straight at the judge. "He's my dad. He takes care of me. I don't want to go with anyone else." The judge exhaled slowly, visibly moved. In the sea of evidence, expert reports, and legal arguments, it was that tiny voice that decided everything. David, pale and visibly shaken, sank into his chair. There was no empire left to save him, only ashes. Michael didn't smile. He only knelt down as Victoria walked back to him and held her tight, with the kind of strength only someone who had just won the only thing that ever truly mattered could have. Not custody, but the right to call her daughter. The official certificate arrived on a quiet afternoon, with no ceremony or fanfare. Henry handed the plain brown envelope to Michael while he was finishing up watering the garden. Water trickled between his fingers, soaking the freshly cut grass, but Michael hardly noticed. His fingers trembled slightly as he tore open the paper. The decision was clear. Michael White, legal guardian and adoptive father of Victoria Bennett. He scanned the words, but they seemed to float, disconnected from reality. The permanent custody was official now, but it wasn't the stamp or the judge's signature that brought him real relief. That had come long before, in that courtroom, when a small, steady voice declared, in front of everyone, that she wanted to stay with him. Victoria sat out on the porch, legs crossed, drawing in a new sketchbook Michael had bought her a few days earlier. Her drawings were simple, flowers, dogs, and a crooked sun in the corner of the page. But in the middle of all the colorful chaos, Michael could see it, a tall figure holding the hand of a smaller one, both of them smiling wide, exaggerated smiles. She never drew faces, just smiles. He walked up to her quietly and sat beside her. Victoria didn't look up right away, too focused on coloring the small figure's dress. It was red, the same color as the dress she wore that night on the bridge. "What are you drawing?" Michael asked, his voice soft. Victoria shrugged, her usual response when she didn't feel like explaining too much. "Us." Michael smiled, his chest tightening with that familiar ache, the strange blend of joy and pain. Knowing she already saw herself beside him as part of something was the kind of validation he'd never dared ask for out loud. "I have something to show you," he said, pulling the certificate from the envelope and setting it between them on the floor. Victoria glanced at it briefly, without much interest. Papers were grown-up things, usually meaningless in her world. But Michael knew she needed to understand. "This says you're officially my daughter," he explained, using the careful tone he'd learned to use with her. "No matter what happens, no one can take you away from me, and I can't leave you." She frowned, processing. "Not even if you want to jump again?" she asked, her voice free of judgment, just curious. Michael swallowed hard. "No, I promise never again." Victoria gave a small nod and went back to her drawing. That was how she handled feelings too big to hold. She retreated into her sketches and her silence, sorting things out in her own time. Michael had learned to respect that. He didn't need to force words into places where they didn't fit yet. But that night, something shifted. After dinner, Victoria followed him into his study. She rarely entered the room. Somehow, even at her age, she seemed to sense it was haunted territory, a place where Michael's ghosts roamed freely. But this time, she came in barefoot, clutching her sketchbook to her chest. Michael looked at her, surprised. "Can I show you something?" she asked. "Of course." She climbed into the armchair beside his desk and flipped through her sketchbook until she found the right page. She held it out to him silently. It was different from her usual drawings. It wasn't just two stick figures holding hands. This time, there was a house, a big one, but not the mansion they lived in. It was colorful, covered in flowers, with open windows. In the middle of the house were the same two figures, one tall, one small, but this time next to the smaller figure there was a single word, written in uneven, careful letters. Daddy. Michael stared at that word, unable to breathe for a moment. It was the first time she'd ever called him that, even if it was in colored pencil, written with hesitant, crooked letters. It hadn't been rehearsed. It hadn't been asked for. It was something she chose, and that meant more than any court decision or official document ever could. "Can I call you that?" Victoria asked softly. Michael pulled her into his lap, unable to hold back the tightness in his throat. "Always," he whispered. Victoria rested her head against his chest, her fingers absent-mindedly fiddling with the buttons on his shirt, a habit she'd picked up after she started feeling safe enough to touch him without fear he'd pull away. Michael took a deep breath, inhaling the scent of her hair, the mix of children's shampoo and sunlight. The days that followed were lighter in ways Michael barely recognized. Victoria laughed more. She was still quiet, Not the kind of child who filled rooms with noise, but the quiet smiles were starting to come. When the dog chased his own tail, when Michael fumbled in the kitchen, when Henry told his wildly exaggerated stories from his days as a driver, each smile was a victory. Vanessa appeared one last time, weeks later, standing just beyond the gate. Michael met her there, not inviting her in, but not shutting her out either. Vanessa looked at him, then at the house, and finally at Victoria, who was playing on the swing. "She's okay," Vanessa said, more to herself than to him. "She is," Michael replied. "Does she know who I am?" Vanessa asked. "She does," Michael said, "but she's not ready. You have to respect that." Vanessa nodded, her eyes glistening. "I'll wait," she said, "as long as she knows I never stopped loving her." "Loving her is more than showing up," Michael said. "But I think you've already learned that." Vanessa gave him a sad but genuine smile. "Take care of her, Daddy." Michael didn't correct her. He just nodded. And then Vanessa left, fading back into the world like a shadow slipping under the door, leaving behind a girl who had chosen her own place. Victoria didn't need a perfect mother. She needed someone who stayed, and Michael had chosen to stay. That night, just before bed, Victoria dragged her pillow into Michael's room, something she still did from time to time whenever the nightmares came back. She curled up on the floor beside his bed, her hand clutching the corner of the blanket, as if that was enough to make sure he was still there. "Good night, Daddy," she whispered. Michael stared at the dark ceiling, the warmth spreading through his chest, something he'd once thought impossible. Family isn't who gives you life. Family is who chooses to love you, even knowing you come with scars. And in the quiet comfort of that night, father and daughter, broken, mended, but whole together, finally found home. I hope you enjoyed today's story. If you did, subscribe to the channel so you don't miss more stories like this. Leave a like and comment below what you thought about the story. See you in the next video.